told these three defendants repeatedly he could not breathe.
He was violent and he was extremely high in methamphetamine.
What happened on the night of March 3rd, 2020? In opening statements, the prosecution and defense made it clear they starkly disagree about what happened between Manuel Ellis and Tacoma police officers just before his death. Yesterday, Ellis's sister testified to his state of mind in the hours before he died, saying he was happy and upbeat. In March 2020, Manuel Ellis died while he was handcuffed in police custody. 3 officers involved in the incident are on trial. Matthew Collins and Christopher Burbank are charged with second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. Timothy Rankin is charged with first-degree manslaughter. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Christine Pae. For the duration of the trial, King 5 will recap the biggest developments in the courtroom, and we will discuss what it all means. Today, we sit down with retired Pierce County Superior Court Judge Brian Tollefson. Thank you so much for being here. And King 5's Drew Mikkelsen will talk with us from the Pierce County Courthouse in Tacoma. Also joining us from our newsroom is former Pierce County Prosecutor Mark Lindquist and David B. Owens, an assistant professor of law at the University of Washington. First, let's get to Drew Mikkelsen. So Drew, you have been in the courthouse every day this first week. What has been your biggest takeaway from the trial so far?
Well, Christine, for me, it's just the 2 completely different stories that are being painted for jurors in this case. The prosecutors maintain that Manuel Ellis was happy and calm, just walking home late one night when he was attacked by the officers. But the attorneys for those officers say instead, it was Ellis who was the aggressor. He was the one who threatened the officers, started the fight with them. This trial is expected to last until December, if not longer than that, potentially with more than 100 witnesses being called to testify. Both sides agree Manuel Ellis did have his problems with depression and an addiction to meth. But in opening statements, jurors heard 2 very different versions of what happened that night. State prosecutors say he was attacked, the officers choked him, restrained him, and he died from a lack of oxygen. But defense attorneys for the officers say they are going to argue that Ellis was the aggressor. He was the one who started the fight. He died from a lethal dose of methamphetamine that he had taken that night. The state's first witness was a video analyst who testified Ellis's hands appeared to be up with palms open during the attack when he was tased 3 times by the Tacoma police officers. But that witness also testified that there is no video of the start of that fight. Now, the second witness that was called by the state was Manuel Ellis' sister, Monet Carter Mixon. She described her brother as a loving relative, a son, an uncle, someone who, yes, had his demons, but someone who she trusted to babysit her kids. She testified that she heard a phone call Ellis made to their mother the day he died.
He was trying to get my mom to come to church with him because he had just gotten back from revival, and it was like a good experience for him, and he wanted her to come to church. He had told her that she looked pretty. He sounded really happy and like upbeat.
A few hours after that phone call is when Ellis had the encounter with police. Was he still happy and upbeat, or was he high on meth and the aggressor in the night? That is what the jurors are going to have to decide at the end of this trial. We're going to hear from another relative of Manuel Ellis on Monday. His mother is set to take the stand. Christine?
Thank you so much, Drew. And part of the defense's case, by the way, rests on whether Ellis died from a meth overdose or from restraint. Ellis's sister testified that family members were worried Ellis's meth addiction would kill him. During cross-examination, she said the family feared it could be during a drug deal, but they were not concerned that he might overdose.
He was putting himself in harmful situations to get hurt. I mean, people that use drugs they can get killed in a drug deal gone wrong. It's dangerous, and I didn't want that for my brother.
So I'm going to open this up to everybody. How might that impact this testimony from when we hear from family members? What might that have on the jury?
Well, I'll start out by just saying from front, I was trying to watch this not only from a judicial perspective, but just from a juror perspective. And you'll notice that there's very little cross-examination of the witness. So I think that I don't think there's much dispute about what happened before the encounter with the police. about his state of mind before the encounter with the police. That's what my takeaway was. The question is whether he still had the same state of mind during his encounter with the police.
So, Mark, one thing that we want to ask you, since you are a former prosecutor, at one point in week one, a defense attorney objected to the answer to a question asked by another defense attorney. Can you share with us how multiple defendants adds to the complexity of this trial and the case?
But there are advantages and disadvantages of having multiple defense attorneys. Advantage of a single defense attorney is you have a consistent message. But one of the advantages of having multiple defense attorneys is that you get to repeat your arguments, and repetition is valuable in a trial. Additionally, one of the things that happened in this case that's unusual is one of the defense attorneys, Mr. Osser, waived his opening. Normally that would be a tactical mistake in a trial because juries start leaning one way or the other pretty early in a case. But Mr. Osser was able to waive his opening because he had two other defense attorneys who were making their opening, and that gives Mr. Osser an opportunity to do his opening right before the defense makes the case. So, as I said, advantages and disadvantages.
Thank you, Mark. And so let's get into a little bit of the opening statements. This week started with opening statements, and the prosecution was the one that spoke first. Take a listen.
As he told these three defendants repeatedly, he could not breathe. We are here today because none of this should have happened. Mr. Ellis should not have died that night. He should not have been held down to the pavement with an officer on his back. And the evidence will show that Mr. Ellis did nothing wrong.
The prosecution emphasized that the officers heard Ellis say that he could not breathe. I'll open this up to everyone again for the prosecution to know that the officers heard Ellis say that. How does it set the stage for the trial overall?
Well, I remember that one of the defense attorneys had a different story about how many times Mr. Ellis said, "I can't breathe, sir." She was trying to make the argument, although you're not supposed to make arguments in opening statements, that maybe he only said that once. But she said, she made an argument that way.
So I had a thought about
Go ahead, Mark.
the issue with respect to Mr. Ellis saying, "I cannot breathe." He didn't just say that, he said, "I cannot breathe, sir." And I think if you're asking questions about his state of mind and what was going on and whether or not he was complying with the officers, he's even in the moment in which precedes his death, he's still treating them with respect and calling them sir. And the truth of the matter is that they didn't stop. They didn't evaluate that. They didn't, "Oh, you can't breathe? What are the things that we're doing here that are causing you to say that?" And so I think that's a crucial part of the evidence in the case.
Yes, and David, I do remember Kent Liu, who delivered the opening statements, really emphasized that "sir" part of the statements during his opening statements. Now, as we've already touched on, the defense painted a drastically different picture in their opening statements. Here's their part of it. Take a listen.
The Manny Ellis that he talked to you about is not the Manny Ellis that faced Officer Burbank and Officer Collins on March 3rd, 2020 around 11:30 at night. That evening, the Manny Ellis that they encountered was aggressive, he was violent, and he was extremely high in methamphetamine.
The defense alleges that Ellis was behaving erratically, that he instigated a conflict with the officers and was attempting to get into a car at the intersection where the conflict took place. So this question seems to fall on video evidence. How might this help the officers defend against these charges? Drew, if you can elaborate on that maybe.
Yeah, well, that's really going to be the crux of the case. Is what was his condition, and we're going to hear from medical experts on both sides of the case on this cause of death. Was it the drugs? Was it a lack of oxygen? Was it a mixture of both? Was it some prior health conditions that Mr. Ellis had? All of that is going to be played out here, and the legal minds on the other side of the camera here will know how potentially long that will take, but we are expecting to hear from lots of doctors who are going to be taking apart this case and the findings of the medical examiner here. And I think that's what they are hoping, the defense attorneys are hoping, raises that suspicion or that that little bit of doubt that the defense attorneys need to get an acquittal in this case.
And Mark, I do want to open this up to you as well. You know, we have seen some of that cell phone video, but we're also going to be hearing more from the witnesses and upcoming testimony. How important might that be in the trial?
I think the key witnesses in this case, unquestionably, are the officers. The jurors are going to be wondering, are these rogue officers, or are these just good guys doing the best they could under challenging circumstances? So there's going to be a lot of witnesses. These experts, they'll agree and disagree. But in the end, it's the defendant officers that the jurors are really going to be glued onto in making their decision based upon.
I got you, Mark. And Judge Tollefson, if we can turn this question over to you. During opening statements, the defense asked prosecutors not to overuse the phrase hog tie. This is an effort to avoid inflaming the jury. What could be considered inflammatory in the courtroom, and why is that something the lawyers need to actually avoid?
Well, you want to have the jury focus on the facts and not be emotionally swayed one way or the other. So they're trying to make sure that the jurors are paying attention to the facts and not hot phrases, let's put it that way.
I do remember even in the opening statements, Kent Liu brought out actual props of the water and the donuts as something visual for the jury to see. So I think that was actually struck down. One thing that I do want to discuss as well, that this is also a case undoubtedly about race. In opening statements, the defense made efforts to distance this case from the trial and the death of George Floyd. Something that I want to ask Professor Owens about. Can you tell us why that delineation is important for the jury to know about?
Yeah, I think this really goes to a number of the issues that we've been discussing, and actually the last two comments about what's highly prejudicial or inflammatory, and also about the credibility of the officers and the role that video plays in this case. The reason that George Floyd, everybody knows that he was murdered, is because there's a video of pretty much the whole thing, and we could all see it and watch it and understand what happened. A difficulty here is that did the same thing occur, but the entire thing isn't captured on video. And I think that for people in communities that are over-policed and people in communities where they're the same types of allegations, they're saying, look, what happened to George Floyd, what happened to Eric Garner, things that are happening to us, but there's no video to prove it. And I do think that this is a big concern for people of color and in the black community in particular, that our voices, our stories about police violence aren't credited unless there's some really shocks the conscience type of video that exists. And so that's, I think, one big thing. And just if I can, you mentioned something about what's prejudicial and what's inflammatory evidence. And I think that from my perspective, the defense in this case has already been able to invoke emotion, right? So there's two things in particular. One, this idea that meth usage implies violence. Social science shows that black men in particular are perceived to be more aggressive and dangerous just by the fact that they use drugs or something like that. So if you have the comparable inference here of a white college kid who's high on mushrooms or something like that, people don't assume dangerousness. But when it's a black man, so social science has shown there's bias there. So that's already baked into the trial. But to make matters worse, another clip from the defense opening, that they were allowed to put in the fact of Mr. Ellis's prior arrests, in which they also involve drug use. And this is the quintessential thing in the law. We call it propensity, an inference that if somebody was aggressive on one instance, that makes it more likely that they were aggressive in this particular case. So from my perspective, the defense has already been able to put in significant evidence that would be highly emotionally inflammatory and creates a strong inference of bias here.
One thing I do want to point out is that this happened in March 2020. This was before what happened to George Floyd. And then, of course, 2020, COVID-19 comes into the picture. It's been a long time coming that we're seeing this trial happen. It's been 3 years. Can you all emphasize sort of the gravity and the importance of this trial? And it's been sort of a long time coming for the family, especially.
Not unusual for a big case like this to take 3 years to see a courtroom. And one of the things that the judge said I wanted to comment upon, the judge is absolutely correct that we asked jurors to base their decisions on the facts and not emotions, but jurors are human. They're driven to a large degree by emotions, and any good trial attorney is going to try to appeal to the jurors' emotions. And that's one of the reasons the prosecution brought in the sister today. Now, the sister wasn't there, doesn't know what happened, but she's there to humanize Mr. Ellis for the jury.
Actually, Mark, that is a good point. You know, we heard from the sister very early on. This is already the first week of testimony. Was there any strategy on that on the prosecution's part?
No, absolutely. That's one of the first things you want to do is put on family members who can sympathize, or rather get the jurors to sympathize with the victim, to humanize him.
Absolutely. Drew Mikkelsen, I want to go over to you. A lot happened in court this week. What can we expect in the weeks or even perhaps the next couple of months coming up?
Well, let's talk about next week, first of all. I think the humanization effort is going to continue on the fact of the prosecutors, because Marcia Carter, Manuel Ellis' mother, is the next witness to testify. She is going to describe probably in more detail about that final phone call she had with her son where he was loving, inviting her to church, saying that she looked pretty. That's the kind of thing that jurors are potentially going to remember, even if it is weeks down the road. So we'll hear from her. There will be a couple of technical experts. One is going to be a crime scene reconstruction expert that'll lay out where everybody was at the time, where the witnesses were. And then the one other witness that we've been told to expect early next week is a woman by the name of Sarah McDowell. She is one of the folks who took cell phone video of that encounter with police. If you follow the case, you may remember, you could hear her screaming along the line, "Stop hitting him, just arrest him." That was taken that night, and this video didn't surface for 3 months after Manuel Ellis' death, and likely only because his sister went on social media saying, "Does anyone know anything about what happened to my brother?" And she contacted the sister. She's going to testify to this, that she thought something bad had happened that night and she wanted that video out there. So that will also be potentially some emotional testimony that could stick with the jurors even for the next couple of months. But we will be hearing from, as I said, medical experts, dozens of law enforcement officers, including, we know at least one of the defendants, Timothy Rankin. His defense attorney, in her opening statements, Ann Bremner, said that he was planning on testifying at some point in this trial in his own defense. We're not sure about the other two at this point.
Right, and we will look forward to much more testimony and a lot more analysis ahead. Before we say goodbye, I do want to get some final thoughts from Mark and from David, and of course Judge Tollefson. What are your final thoughts on just how things have been going so far in the first week of testimony? If I can start with you, Mark.
Okay. You know, there is such a thing as primacy, and as I said earlier, jurors tend to lean one way or the other pretty early in the game, but here, as has been pointed out, there are two just vastly different stories being presented by the two sides, and so I think jurors at this point are probably sitting back and kind of wait and see. And as I commented earlier, I think they're really waiting to hear from the officers. Experts, both sides like to call experts, lawyers call experts, but I think jurors give experts a lot less weight than lawyers sometimes think. This case is going to come down to the testimony of the officers, is my take.
All right, Mark and David, how about you?
Yeah, I think that that's right, that the officer's testimony is, if they do choose to testify, will be important. And again, I want to just come back to the characterization of the video. From what you can see and how Mr. Ellis acted in that video, I think it's going to be central to this, which is like, is the defense going to really argue, don't believe what you're seeing in that video, it says something else? And if they can convince folks of that, or even some folks of that, then that could very significantly sway the outcome of the trial.
All right, David, and Judge Tollefson, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's really, we're in the early stages of this case. I know we've had opening statements and we've had a couple of witnesses. We've had one expert, we've had the sister, and I hope that everybody is going to remember this is a long, long trial, and I hope the jurors will remember their oath that they're going to keep an open mind throughout the entire trial and base their decision based upon all the evidence they hear for all the evidence that is presented to them up to the very, very end of the trial, and not deliberate till they get into the jury room after closing arguments.
Certainly, that is very essential. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for all of your analysis. There is much more to discuss in coming weeks and in the next couple of months. By the way, we'll have more coverage coming up every Friday. You can tune in on our streaming app, King 5 Plus, available on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV. Our weekly recap is also available on YouTube. As always, you can keep up to date with our trial coverage on king5.com and our mobile app.